Welcome, 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 everyone. Look at all these beautiful people joining us. Welcome to IFTF Foresight Talks with me, Jane McGonigal, your host for today. And joining me is Hal Hershfield, an amazing researcher and author. As we let folks in, we always like to know where you're joining us from. And if you want to tell us anything about yourself, an organization you work with, a topic you're interested in, go ahead and just tell us in chat where you're joining from and what's something you're interested in or what kind of work you do. Hi, Kenny, joining from just across the bay in Oakland. Great to see you. Let's see who else is in the room. Hi, Robert. Hi, Cara. Hi, Liz. Look at all these beautiful people joining. Oh, from YPO, Young Professionals. We love that. Well, we always also, in addition to knowing where folks are joining us from, we like to have kind of a warm-up conversation. I'm going to be asking our guests lots of questions today, but you're all our guests too. So I'd like to ask you a question. We're here to talk about our future selves, how we connect to our future self and relate to our future self and help and empower our future self. And so to get us warmed up for that topic, I would like to know if you could drop an answer in chat. What is a positive change that you would like to see happen or make happen in your own life or in your community by the year 2033? And look at I just saw somebody join from Pakistan, from South Africa, from the Philippines, from Sweden, from New Zealand, from Venezuela. We've gone global today. So yeah, what's the change like to see? I'm thinking a lot about clean air equity due to the wildfire and the smoke crisis that many of us are living through. And so I would like to see everyone, every home, every building, every workplace, every community center, every apartment building have clean air spaces with purifiers and 24/7 access to clean air for every person in my community by 2033. And we're seeing lots of great answers in the chat: human scale cities, electric vehicle chargers everywhere. What else would you like to see? More kids in the street, fewer cars, an end to homelessness. A lot of folks thinking about fewer cars. Interesting. Clean air. Basic income by 2033. I love that. Global reparations. Less hurry, more balance, making it easier for people to find meaningful work. More green space. Hal is joining us at IFTF for the first time in a while. How do you like these futures? Are this making you feel optimistic about the future? I love asking people about what could be better in a decade.
Yeah, I love it. I love it. All good things. And it's of course it's like all the social issues of today.
Yes.
Thinking about how they may change down the line.
Wonderful. And I'm so intrigued that everybody is sharing big community changes, right? Not necessarily just something in their family or their own individual life, which is different from when we first started asking this question, I would say. In my work at IFTF, I think we're all aware of structural changes will ripple out to all of us. Well, thank you everyone for joining us today. We have over 100 people here already and people coming in every second. Keep that chat open so you can share your thoughts and feedback throughout. We love for y'all to talk to each other during these webinars. And then look for that Q&A button if you want to submit a question for our guest today. We'll be collecting your questions throughout the hour, and in the second half, you'll be doing all the asking and I'll be reading your questions. So go ahead and make sure if you have a question for Hal, don't put it in the chat, put it in that Q&A box. Other practical reminders: this will be recorded and posted if you want to share it or come back to it. We are here as part of the Institute for the Future's public webinar series, and we're in conversation with Hal Hershfield, who is an author, a professor of psychology, and an amazing thinker. here's what I would like you to know about IFTF if you're joining us for the first time. The Institute for the Future is an independent public interest organization founded in 1968. We're based in Silicon Valley, and our mission is to help organizations and leaders become future ready so we can make all of those positive changes that we're imagining and also be ready for whatever disruptions might be ahead. And we provide lots of different practical tools and research and programs that can turn foresight into insights that lead to action and positive change. If you're interested in joining us, we have a whole portfolio of online and in-person learning, online live, or you can take classes with us on Coursera. My producer today, Aicha, is dropping links in the chat if you'd like to come and even earn a certificate in foresight practice and make this your career. You can do that. These are some of our upcoming trainings around the world, in person, in Berlin, in Washington, D.C. We've got time zones for all regions of the world. Aicha is going to drop those links in chat. My favorite thing that I like to tell people about is our Urgent Optimists community, where we have a future scenario club. It's like a book club, but for future scenarios. We go on signals of hope scavenger hunts, which are signals of change that make us feel hopeful about the future. It's our first public membership program, so you can join us and hang out with us there to build your urgent optimism. One way we're going to build urgent optimism for the future is by talking to our guest for today, Hal Hershfield. Let me tell you a little bit about Hal. He is a professor of marketing, behavioral decision-making, and psychology at UCLA's Anderson School of Management, and his research sits at the intersection of psychology and economics. He examines the ways that we can improve our long-term decisions. He earned his PhD in psychology at Stanford University, and he publishes research in top academic journals. And also he writes op-eds and essays for the New York Times, Harvard Business Review, Wall Street Journal, and more. He's also won a ton of teaching awards, so we're very lucky that he's here to teach us today by sharing some research and insights from his amazing new book, which I absolutely love. It's called Your Future Self: How to Make Tomorrow Better Today. And this contains many amazing practical habits and practices and really aha insights that once you read them, you're like, I will never think about my future self the same way again. Hal, welcome to IFTF.
Thank you, Jane. I'm so excited to talk with you.
Well, I always like to start by giving folks the chance just to get to know you better. You are a professor, you are a researcher. Can you just give us a little insight into the kinds of big, juicy questions that keep you up at night, that inspire your research, and the types of tools and methodologies that you use to answer those questions?
Yeah, sure. So, I would say that I'm really driven by, you were sort of talking about, in my bio there, right? I like to examine long-term decision-making, often much more at the individual level, though I'm starting to look at it on the collective level as well. But when I started doing research, I used to say, oh, it's important to look at, how do we get people to save more, eat healthier, these sorts of things. And at some point I realized it's not like up to me or any other researcher to say like what someone else should be doing. So the types of questions that really keep me up at night are trying to understand times when people say that they want to do something and then they can't do it or they're not doing it. So I really like looking at those gaps between intentions and behaviors. And how do I look at it? I really, maybe it's that I get sort of like tired or bored of the same methodology. So I really like to use a lot of different tools, from surveys, and sort of lab experiments, which is something that people in my, space do a lot of. But also I like to look at big data sets and, archival data sets. And I like to use new forms of technology, virtual reality, eye tracking, AI, whatever it may be, natural language processing, these sorts of things that basically can allow us to get insights on the same sort of social, psychological, and behavioral problems, but use different viewpoints and different lenses to understand them.
I'm so excited by something you just said, if I can reflect back to you for a moment. When you and I first met, a decade or more ago, a lot of the early research in the space was, as you said, very focused on here's what we, think are the most rational, in a person's best interest actions that somebody could take. Save money for retirement, eat healthier instead of eating, fun food, studying, instead of procrastinating. And the research literature was really about, what stands in the way from people doing these things that we think are almost like paternalistically the right way to approach your future. And that's an amazing shift that you're describing in your own work, and maybe helping, I think, break open the field a little bit in that way, that it's really not that there is a right way to approach our futures, but that if we have a goal or value that we want to wake up in a world, or we want to be a certain way in the future, what's going to stand in our way? That's amazing, actually. So I want to celebrate that for a moment.
I agree. I think it's so important to have that shift.
That's great. Okay, well, you have been doing this research for a long time. For folks who might be familiar with your work through IFTF, it could be because you were the lead researcher for a really seminal study that we talk about all the time about how we treat our future selves as strangers. And this book really builds on that seminal research. So can you tell us a little bit about how did you find yourself turning these studies into a book? What was it like to write this book? Was this a labor of love? Did it just flow through you? How did this book come? And happy book birthday, by the way.
2 days ago.
Yeah.
2 days ago. Yeah, no, thanks. No, it's funny because I have been thinking about this research for years now. It's funny, we don't want to think of ourselves as old. And so I say, well, I started this a couple years ago, and then I realized oh no, it was more like 15 years ago. And that, it's confronting because now I have to realize, I've
you are the future
years.
self you would have been when you started the work.
Exactly. Yeah. Older than even. But the process of writing the book was it was so different from what I had anticipated. I mean, it's like a great, almost like meta example of how it's hard to anticipate things in the future. I thought it was going to be this incredible labor and so difficult. And it was in some ways, but not necessarily in the ways that I thought. The writing was in some ways easy because I had so much fun talking to really interesting people and, digging into research that I hadn't, really been familiarized with. And, what was hard was literally like figuring out the time to sit down and do the thing. But I just loved meeting people who have so many interesting stories about the ways that they relate to themselves in the past and now and in the future as well, and then sort of weaving that in with the research as well. It was really eye-opening for me to get all those contexts.
Okay, well, we're going to let you tell some of those favorite stories. The way you set up the book, the first part, is really guided by 3 big, juicy questions. So I thought I could pose those questions to you as you structure the beginning, and then, play with what you'd like to answer with them. I will say one of my favorite things in the first part of the book is when you talk about that kind of Venn diagram of, is my future self me, or is it someone else? So, feel free to do a little Venn diagram for us. But the big questions that drive the first part: who is our future self? Are we the same over time? And is future me really me? Which is like almost like a Zen cone. Like, I love that. So, what do you have to tell us about our future self?
Right. So, I mean, it's funny because when I started asking these questions, this question of, is that really me? Who is my future self? Are they the same over time? I almost feel like I approached them thinking that I'd be able to get some sort of cut and dry, black and white answer, which is, I mean, I didn't really think that, but I sort of was hoping, I'll be able to distill this neatly. The reality is these are big, juicy, messy questions, and I'll tell you 2 of the insights that popped out when I was working on the book. So one is that we can never really know our future selves because we can't anticipate how changes that occur in our lives will change us. L.A. Paul is this wonderful philosopher at Yale, and she's talked about this from the guise of transformative experiences, that if I move cities or I get married or I have kids or I change careers, any of these sort of big things, those will change me in ways that I can't fully anticipate. And there's something that's, almost scary about the idea that like I can't necessarily be, knowing who I'll be. But then I really love it because it suggests that we can't know that, but we can strive for certain aspects that that may remain continuous between now and later. And what I mean by that is, and this is I think like one of the other big insights that came out from that early first part of the book, was that some research says that when we try to think about what makes someone the same over time, what we're really thinking about is what's known as essential moral traits. And these are the things that we can point to say that sort of boils down. That's the essence of Jane. You are funny, and the philosopher is L.A. Paul. I saw that in the chat there. You're funny and kind and compassionate. And I mean, I'm sure there's many more sort of essential moral traits that I could use to describe you, Jane, but right, those are some of the things. If the next time we met, you were somehow deeply serious and not funny at all, and your background was all black and white, I would say like something's changed about Jane. Like she's no longer the same. But it's interesting because our names can change, and the cities we live in can change, and our friends can change, and all these things can change. And we'll say that's still the same person as long as those essential moral traits remain. And so to sort of bring it back, it's impossible to say are we the same or not, but we can say we're the same, or we're at least similar in these deeper traits. But then on some other levels, we change in major ways.
Okay, Hal. So that's really interesting. Let me tell you about one of the tools we use at the Institute for the Future to help people imagine hard to imagine futures. And maybe you can tell me, is there like some psychology or neuroscience to back this up? I think what you're saying is there is. So we often ask people to imagine things that they don't have direct experience with that would be very disruptive, like a mass climate migration that, affects your community. If you live somewhere now that feels climate safe, but everybody has to leave, let's say in 15, 20 years, or solar radiation management that like turns off the sun for 10 years. What will you do in that future? How will you help yourself and others? Before we give people the scenario, we will have them do something we call pack your bags for the future. And it's a list of things that they expect to bring to any future, no matter how different the circumstances are. And one of the things we ask them to list are their values. So the things that really, that they make a life worth living, that when they do it, it feels meaningful and authentic, and things they love that connect them to others. And then when they show up in that future, we're like, okay, we'll go back to whatever you packed in your bag. What does that value drive you to do? Or what is that passion? How are you going to use that passion in this future? So is that kind of that's the future self that we can, if not predict, at least have like more confidence will still be there when we get to these weird futures?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. So there's a couple of things. So one is, it's really, first off, I think you have to acknowledge it's just really difficult to step into the shoes of that future self and that future world. Yes, with neuroscience, my own research has used neuroimaging to look at what happens when we think about our future selves. And one of the most interesting findings that I can point to is that when we think of our future selves, the brain activity that comes about when we think about that future me, it's actually more similar to what happens when I think about other people, which is, it's wild in a way, because it suggests that there really is this separation between me now and me in the future. Now, I think that's in a way somewhat difficult to grapple with, this idea that there's sort of these like separate selves there, right? And so you say, well, if I'm me now and there's a separate version of me, it almost makes it easy to understand why we sometimes prioritize today, because it's like the things I want to do right now impact me, and the consequences are going to happen to some like other person down the line, right?
Yes.
Now, I love your idea of sort of packing the bags and thinking about values, because there are other people in our lives who are separate from us, but we do share values with them, and that's what connects us. So, I think about our partners, our kids, our parents, our best friends, those are separate entities. My
Mm.
wife is a different person. My kids are different people, but there is this strand of connection because we do have shared values and they grow together. And I think the exercise you're talking about really helps to connect the sort of present to the future because values can be a consistent strand.
You're making me think that there might be some benefit also to treating our future self if it is other, and it's going to be almost impossible to convince our brain that we're literally talking about me still, 10 to 20 years from now, to approach our future self as a loved one, as somebody we love, like we would a partner or a child, and try to care for our future self that way. That
Yeah.
I've never thought of that before. That's really sparking some ideas.
Well, and it's a strange thing because it's an analogy we have to sort of acknowledge, right? But it's like a slightly problematic one because we eventually turn into our future selves, and we don't eventually turn into our spouses or our kids. But I really love the idea of the loved one or the person for whom we feel a sense of caring responsibility. It's not pity. That doesn't move the needle. It's the same way we feel about our kids or our best friends, our spouses. It's like, I want to do something to help you. And that attitude can be really meaningful when it comes to our own future selves.
Okay, something you just said reminded me of a practice that you describe in the book, which is the practice of writing letters to our future self, but then making sure we actually get them, which I think is really important because it gives us a lived experience of, as you just said, becoming our future self. We may not ever know our future self until we get there, but you write in the book about that practice and how important it is to actually deliver the letter. Can you just tell us a little bit about how would you recommend people approach this or incorporate it, and why is it important that we actually get, when we become our future self, we get that letter from our past?
Yeah, so that there's of course, I think most people have come face to face with this practice of whether it's like writing making a time capsule or one of these future oriented letters. It's the end of the school year for a lot of kids right now, so I think a lot of kids have done this earlier in the year. So a guy I've become friends with, Matt Sly, when he was a kid, this is about 20 years ago, he did one of these things, write the letter to your future self. And he was disappointed, it just went out into the world and nothing happened. And so he created this amazing site called Future Me, futureme.org. And the gist there is that you can write, well, this is an email, so it's a little more modern. And then you just say when you want it to come back to you. It's a wonderful tool because not only are you writing a letter, but as you said, then you get it back. And one of the things that happens there is it really fosters a conversation between your current self and your future self, and then your past self.
Yeah.
And there's some fascinating research suggesting that receiving time capsules from the past actually boosts our well-being. And one of the reasons it does so is because it makes us appreciate ordinary experiences. So we think, oh, there's these extraordinary experiences, and I'll remember my wedding, and I'll remember a big holiday, and I'll remember these things. But one of the things we fail to consider is that what really makes up most of the fabric of our lives is the ordinary. And when people get a time capsule from the past, it reminds them of ordinary experiences that they may have otherwise forgotten. Which is just, it's like it's a beautiful thing because those things they just disappear in memory, and then we're reminded of them and we can suddenly come back to that moment. I'll just say one other thing about the letter writing from the research side. One of the things that researchers have been finding is that these letters to your future selves, they work better. And when I say better, they work better by really connecting us to our future selves if we also write a letter back from our future self. So don't just write the letter, but then take the extra step and step into your shoes of your future self and imagine what they are feeling talking back to you now. I mean, it's sort of a crazy exercise, but I think a lot of people here think about these sorts of things regularly. And so
Yes,
that's
yeah.
really valuable.
Okay, so you have to deliver the future letter in the future, so you can have that experience of meeting and becoming that future self, but also when you're doing it, write a letter back, so that you can put yourself in the role of that future self. It's interesting. That's become more of a practice in foresight work, where if you're doing a participatory futures program, you might ask a certain number of participants to adopt the role of somebody, citizens 50 years from now. And they have to advocate on behalf of their, you're attending this meeting not as yourself today, but yourself, at age 70 or whatever it might be. And it turns out that people who are role playing as themselves in the future, or just ordinary citizens in the far future, are much more in favor of policies and programs that have a long-term benefit. So it seems like the same kind of technique works for both personal change and maybe societal change.
I mean, I would think so. And one of the sort of mechanisms, what's happening under the hood there, is that it forces the abstract to become more concrete, right? And so, I mean, I think nobody's surprised that there are future generations that we're talking about, right? Nobody's surprised that, there's an older version of me. But when sort of left to our own devices, those future generations and future selves are really pretty abstract concepts. And the exercise you're talking about, it really just kind of grounds things and makes it a lot easier to say, what will life be like? I can't know, but I could try to take a guess, and I think it's most likely going to provoke some more empathy
Yes.
for those future selves and future others.
And that's so building empathy for our future selves and future society is a lot of what you talk about in the book. And you give some really helpful sort of frameworks for getting better at what you call, and what we at IFTF call, mental time travel, these acts of imagination and these acts of empathy fostering. So do you want to give, your definition of mental time travel, and then maybe break down some of the ways it goes wrong for most people, or mistakes that are common, and how to fix them?
Sure, absolutely. I mean, mental time travel, it sounds like this sci-fi concept, but it's not, right? It's really just any time we're thinking about a different time than now. And we're really good at this. I mean, what's amazing as human beings is that we have this incredible ability to think ahead and think back. And it's in complicated ways too. Like, I can think ahead and imagine what I'm going to feel now, and then consider how what I'm doing right now impacts what I'm going to do tomorrow, and so on and so on. So in theory, we can be really good at this, but we often get a little messed up. So you asked, about when it goes wrong. And so I like to think about it. And this was, earlier you asked about the process of writing the book. I had some fun sort of thinking about, analogies. And one of the things I like to think about with these mental time travel mistakes is, well, taking it literally from a time travel, or from a travel perspective. So one mistake we make is that I sort of call it missing your flight. You go to the airport and you're there on time, and you decide to, I don't know, go to the airport bar, get a drink, or you read a book, and you get so engrossed in what you're doing that you look up and your flight is left. And it's like, I haven't had this happen yet, but I feel like I've become close enough that I'm worried it's going to. But the gist here is that we get anchored on the present and don't fully consider the future. So, the missing your flight is essentially staying so focused on what's happening right now that we don't fully plan ahead and really, really think into the even near term or distant future. There's another mistake, which is when we convince ourselves that we're thinking ahead a little bit, but we just don't do it in that deep of a way. I call this, poor trip planning, right? And so it's like, we know we're going on a trip, and let's say I'm going to New York next week, and I know I'm going there, and I've booked the hotel. So I tell myself, okay, I did this, that's great. And then I get there and I realize I haven't done anything else. And so now, now I'm left spending like 30% of my time on this trip figuring out what I want to do. And there's
Mm.
some role for spontaneity for sure, but wouldn't it have been better to do a little more planning, right? But the funny thing is we tell ourselves we've thought ahead, and it's just on a really surface level. Procrastination, by the way, is a classic example of that, where I say, like, I will do that next week. If I really thought deeply about it, I'd realize the thing I don't want to do now, I'm not going to want to do next week.
Well, that was, I
right?
think, I think this came from some of your earlier work that really helped me early in my career, was this idea that you turned me on to, which is that if you're invited to do something or asked to take on some work and you don't want to do it like right now, but maybe like if by the time next week happens, next month or next year, like I'll totally be into it. You told me that I should imagine that I have to do it tomorrow. And would I say yes if I had to do it tomorrow? Because future me is not really nice to like put all this stuff I don't actually want to do now onto my future self. And it really helped me make better decisions and not discount like the feelings of my future self, trying to bring them more present.
Yeah, I love that. Researchers call this the yes damn effect. When I say yes to something, and then later I have to do it, and I'm like, damn it, I shouldn't.
Now I have to do it.
I shouldn't have. It's funny because there are times when it works, right? When like you get asked to do something, and I wouldn't do it next week, and then 3 or 4 months come by, and I have to do the thing, and I'm like, now I'm obligated to do it, and maybe it was a great experience because I hadn't fully anticipated that, but there are a lot of other times where we say yes to things, and it's mean to our future selves because we just put all that stuff on them. And I love the strategy of saying, would I do it next week? Would I do it, tomorrow? And it's not so simple. It's not always say no, always say yes. But again, connecting back to those values, I think is great. Yeah.
What you said about like doing a bad, like we think we're thinking about the future, but we're doing a bad job of it. I mean, you can guess this is like an obsession of the researchers at the Institute for the Future. And one of the conversations that you and I had when we were exploring possible research collaborations was, would it help people do a better job of planning for their future selves if they had access to the types of ideas that professional futurists use to build more realistic ideas about the future? So, for example, the kind of disruption that we're seeing happening with AI and large learning models and chatbots and all of that. At IFTF, like if you had hung out with us 5 or 10 years ago, we'd be saying, okay, imagine it's 2023 and you instead of people, having to write things anymore, these assistants, we have these like verbalists, we could have given you that piece of information that maybe if you were imagining work or learning for your future self, it would have given you some realistic content that to me reminds me of in the book you talk about planning for a trip where you kind of pack for the weather where you live instead of where you're going, because you've never been there before. So you can't really imagine how humid it's going to be or how cold the nights are. Do you feel like, would it help ordinary people to have, not everybody like wants to be a futurist, but to have access to those really specific, plausible, everyday details of the future?
Yeah. So let me take a step back, because what you talked about, this is like one of the other time travel mistakes. Like, I call it packing the wrong clothes, but it's the same. It's like when we used to live in Chicago, and I remember one time we were taking a trip. I forget where it was, going to be somewhere warm, and I was like, I know I need to pack warm clothes. Warm weather clothes. But it was like, 15 degrees and freezing. And I was like, I should still bring a couple of sweaters. And the funny thing is that you sort of get anchored on the present and use that to project ahead. And the mistake there is that when trying to think about some distant future, it's really hard to get sort of unmoored from what's happening right now. So, some of the tools that you're talking about, I do think are really helpful, because it can help sort of just like loosen that anchoring to make sure that we can try to think about possible worlds and possible feelings and experiences and outcomes. The caveat that I would say is that I think we always have to recognize that there needs to be some fluidity and flexibility in the, and that, I can't fully imagine what will happen, but the exercises can start to get me there. But then I of course need to update
Yes.
as the future comes and as the years tick by and as things change.
Right. No, of course, that's great. That's a really great point, because we can't like sit here, write a letter to our future self, and then expect that 10 years from now it's still going to be the future that we imagined. We're constantly sort of rewriting, maybe we're not always looking 10 years out, because as we start to get more accurate information, we can do a better job of like being ready for that future self 2 or 3 or 5 years out. We've got some really juicy questions in the Q&A. I want to remind folks who are with us today, this is a great time to add your question, because like in like a few minutes, we're going to ask your questions. But I want to give you, two sort of burning things I want to talk to you about. One is I want to give you a chance to tell a story about a really fascinating character in your book who, had some issues with like seeing like the future self and the present self. So maybe you can tell us a story, and then I want to ask you about, I guess, like the elephant in the room, which is like the trouble of, or the value of futures thinking when there's so many like urgent issues today, which is, as foresight practitioners, we're constantly wrestling with the urgency of the present versus the future. So we'll come back to that, but tell us the story about this super fascinating character in your book.
Okay, what is it? Let me try to guess. Is it the one in the very beginning of the book? Because there's so many people that I found really fascinating here, but I think it's the man from
Someone who
Brazil.
seemed quite disconnected, but actually turned out to be maybe more connected than.
Okay, so I think you're referring to this guy, Greg Tietz. He was a entrepreneur in the mid 90s in the Midwest. And he was this really interesting guy. In his 20s, he decided that he just wanted to change everything, moved to the Bay Area, and he became this like sort of bartender / bouncer / event planner at the bottom of the hill. It's a little club. And every week he'd have a day off. He would stay up late at night. He'd have a day off, and he would go wander around the city and explore new neighborhoods. And one of these weeks he was in the Mission, which folks not in the Bay Area, little neighborhood, and there's all sorts of burrito joints there. And he's walking around, and I should say as background, he wanted a tattoo. Like, he knew at this period of time he wanted a tattoo. He hadn't got one yet. He walks by this one little burrito spot, and above the logo of the restaurant, it says, "Tattoo me on your body and get free food for the rest of your life." And I should say that the logo was like a little boy on a corncob rocket ship with like a big floppy hat, like sailing off into space.
Who does not want that on their body forever?
so like he sees this and he's like, "This is hilarious." Goes in, like gets a burrito and is like, "It's good enough to have for the rest of my life." And the next day, like, gets the tattoo on his arm. And I read this and I was like, oh my God, like I would be like, is there a disconnect there? I mean, like, would I want that on my arm forever? What if I was like, and Greg was me and I showed you my tattoo right now? But I thought this could be a real mistake. And I should say tattoos are not normally regrettable. Most people love their tattoos, except for if it's like an ex-lover or for the writing, like straight. Anyway, he gets it. And I thought, here's an example of the packing the wrong clothes. I think this thing is really important right now, and I'm going to continue to love this down the line. So I like was really curious. I read about this and I was like curious what he felt, and I was able to track him down. And I had this great call with him, and I was like, first off, tell me, like, do you have like 1 million tattoos now? Because I kind of figured, like, if you get that, you must get another. And he's like, I have one, and it's that tattoo. And I was like, I have to know, do you regret it? And he said, not for an instant. And I was like, well, tell me why. And he said, when I was in my 20s, I could stay up late at night. I could eat burritos once a week. And He's like in his 50s now. He's in the corporate world. He's works for ESPN. And he's like, I can't live that sort of life anymore. But every time I look in the mirror, I'm
Mm,
reminded of that version of me, and I can
mm,
instantly connect back with him.
mm,
And one of the things I loved about this story is I think it really highlighted that we can incorporate change into a self that still has some continuity over time. He
mm,
knows that he's changed from the past to the present. And
mm.
I think he also knows that he will change from the present to the future, but you can still maintain a sense of emotional bonding, emotional connection between those selves. And I thought it was just such a lovely story. And he still has the tattoo, and it's like faded, but it's so
And
great.
still getting how many burritos? Did you ask him how many burritos?
Oh, I mean, here's the sad thing, Jane. The restaurant closed. So
Inability to predict the future.
a Greek spot opened up in its place, and they honored the deal, but I don't think he like loves Greek food as much as burritos, so he stopped going.
I mean, because that's the other great thing about that story, right? Is that the you can anticipate your future goals or wishes or but then if the world around you changes, then that is something the future self winds up adapting to. I
Exactly.
mean, it's a great parable. It also has a kind of like Zen riddle quality to it. I would pose to our guests here today that this is actually like a really interesting thought experiment. Um, if you were to get a tattoo on your body that would allow you to get something free for the rest of your life, like what would that image be? And what would you want to have free for the rest of your life? Like for me, my first answer is like something like about like a running shoe. Like I would love to always have access to the next high-tech running shoe. But in a way that's present me with Jane's 45-year-old knees, but I don't know about 55-year-old or 65 or something like it, I might be doing aqua aerobics or something instead of, so
Shoes won't work there. Yeah.
yeah, so it's an interesting thought experiment that I think I'm glad you tell that story, and I think it actually allows us to sort of reflect on our own, things we love most, but also the unexpected complications that might come away. Well, what do you think about the resistance some people have to thinking about the future, which I think is more now than when I started working in foresight and when you started doing this research, because of the urgency of things like war and climate crises, new social protest movements, and things feel very much that the present moment is like demands that total immersion. What's the balance, or what are the trade-offs? Like, how do you think about that tension between the urgency of the present and the value of thinking about our future selves?
Yeah, I mean, it's something I grappled with throughout writing the book, and in particular at the very end, I was thinking, I wrote the book sort of like through COVID and then through different social protest movements and on and on and on. And so I had that exact worry, because I feel like it can be almost read a little tone deaf to be so focused on the future when like all of this other stuff is going on. I reached out to Xander Rose, who's the executive director of the Long Now Foundation, also in the Bay Area. And he put it really well to me. I mean, and something I've been thinking a lot about, which is that the seeds for many of the present day urgent issues were planted long ago, 20, 30, 40, I mean, decades ago. And we can't say, oh, none of these would be an issue if we'd focused more on them then. But you apply that same thinking, you think, if we just focused on our present day woes right now, what seeds are being planted now that are going to mushroom out of control in the decades to come? And so when it comes to that sort of urgent present versus focus on the future, I don't think it should have to be some sort of like 50-50 trade-off. And I don't think that's even the right ratio. It probably needs to be more toward the present because those things are happening right now. But if you gave me a giant pot of money and said, allocate this toward now and later, I'd put more of it to now, but I would make sure to put a portion of it to the later day problems, the problems that you're dealing with, many of the folks on the call are thinking about, precisely because those are going to be the things that are going to turn into present day urgent issues in 10, 20, 30 years.
I like that you talk about it in a sort of quantitative way, because it makes me want to ask even my colleagues or other professional foresight practitioners. I mean, professionally, we probably spend 80, 90, 100% of our time to the future. And I think a lot of us have wanted to start putting more somehow, like bringing that future urgency to the present. So I like the quantitative, that's your economic background coming in, helping us like think very numerically in a helpful way. We have some great questions. I'm going to start asking you from our group. So Stephen says, what do you foresee regarding the inequality of future selves, meaning those with greater agency today will continue building preferred futures, while those with less agency, perhaps migrants, refugees, may have to continue living with either used futures or futures provided by the global elite? It's a great question.
It's such a good question. In the financial decision-making space, which is some of where my research has lived, there's a big focus right now on what researchers call the democratization of savings. And I would expand that to say, the democratization of future selves. And basically what that means is that it's a lot easier for some groups to save and provide for a better future than for others, and I think, Stephen's question is perfect. It's spot on, because it suggests there's these people who are getting, can only stay in the present, and others who can really plan forward. So, first way to answer is to say, I agree, it's a problem and it needs to be addressed and continue to be addressed. The second way to think about it, from my own research, one of the things that we've been exploring is trying to understand how people think about the quote unquote sacrifices that they make now for later. Because it's really difficult. Saving means spending less, eating healthy means not eating something, right? And so one thing that we've been trying to do is reframe present day sacrifices to feel easier to undertake. So if I can express a message to you that gets you to do something because it seems like it's easier, and now you're sort of in the door and working toward habit formation, I think that's a win. So as a concrete example, my collaborators and I worked with a fintech firm where people were signing up to save. They're trying to save more money, and they get the opportunity to start an automatic savings plan, which is anytime we want to do behavior change, you want to make it automatic, this. And some folks were asked if they wanted to save $150 a month. And some folks were asked if they wanted to save $5 a day. It's the same amount of money, right? Now, what we found was that 7% signed up when it was $150 a month, which actually may seem like a high number, but these are people who were already in this app to save. But 30% signed up when it was $5 a day. What was almost more exciting about this was that when it was framed as $150 a month, you saw this inequality, so that the wealthier people were more likely to sign up and the people who were lower in income were less likely. But when we framed it as $5 a day, now there was no difference. Now people who were at the lowest end of the income spectrum signed up. Now, after a month, more lower income folks dropped out because I think they said, oh, this is more than I could do.
Yeah.
But there were still way more involved and continued to be involved in the savings plan than had we just started by framing it as sort of this big chunk, right? And so that is just one example, and still $5 a day, $150 a month, that's still a lot of money.
Yeah. So democratizing our future selves partly is about making sure that we're framing opportunity to invest in our future selves or our future society in ways that feel manageable. And I think that's interesting because I do think that applies to social issues as well, like asking people to commit to, supporting some kind of positive transformation in society. What's the $5 a day version of that feels realistic and
Yeah.
within our means, with what is
Well,
within our means. Yeah.
right. And actually some researchers have been playing around with this for charity. So if I want you to donate time, you're more likely to do it if I break it down into smaller and smaller bits, right? So I mean, and that's another, I would say that's another sort of like aspect of social change. But you're right. I mean, I think there's so much more that needs to be done on figuring out how do we chunk things down to make it easier to do it.
Awesome. Well, let me get you another question from our audience. Kelly asks, where to go? I'd be interested to know why some people, me, are really good with connecting to our future selves in some scenarios, money, diet, physical health, mental health, rest, but are terrible in others. Why do we connect fully with some part of our future self, but not another part? That's interesting. Is that values or what is that?
That is such a deep question. Psychologists call this, domain specificity. Basically, it means there are different domains. Walter Mischel, who is wonderful researcher who he's famous for the marshmallow studies among kids, but he would talk about this with self-control. And he would actually point to Bill Clinton. He said, Bill Clinton is a master of self-control when it comes to negotiations, when it comes to sitting in a room for days on end and figuring out the right sort of patient strategy. But of course, I think we can point to other areas where he wouldn't have been a master of self-control, right? And so what that suggests is that the self is a multitude of domains and values. And Kelly's question is exactly right. Like I might be good in one space and not another. And so one way to think about this is to try to tap into who that future self is with respect to a certain outcome or behavior, right? So if it is the sleep one, right? So I stay up too late and I don't get enough sleep. And I know someone earlier said, oh, that reminds them of a Seinfeld bit. There's a wonderful bit about that. Well, let me think about the specific things that I can do to change that habit. Let me think about the specific ways that I will feel that future me, tomorrow future me, will feel if I'm tired and cranky because I stayed up too late. And that is different from going on a run or eating healthy or saving or and so on. So there's specific domains, and I think we can try to tap into those specific domains when we think of our future self.
Well, this actually connects with a question that jumped out at me from the audience. Wazi asked, to what degree can optimism or pessimism influence what our future self may be like or how we relate to our future selves? Is that something that you have looked at? Because we certainly find some people tend to have what we call more of a shadow imagination. Their mind more readily imagines difficult or challenging futures, and others have what we call more of a positive imagination. They just, wow, this is like these amazing things could totally happen. Do people have that and relate to their future selves that way?
Yeah, well, one of my favorite bits of research on that idea actually goes at it from the perspective of the optimism and almost idealism. So some research has found that if we think idealistically about the future in a positive fantasy type of way, that can actually be detrimental to taking action, because I can like sit and I'll fantasize about a lovely future and I get some energy from doing that, and then I just go about my day and don't do any of the concrete steps that are needed to get there. And so one recommendation is to engage in an exercise known as mental contrasting. And I love this because it really takes both the optimistic side and the realist side. I don't know if it connects the pessimistic side, but basically the idea is to say, where am I right now? Where do I want to be in terms of an ideal positive future? And what stands in my way? What's the contrast? And then what can I do to overcome it? But really, really importantly, here's a way to combat the pessimism. Think about overcomable obstacles, not like I'll never be able to get there. That's pessimistic. But rather, what are the little things that stand between now and later that I can actually do, that I can actually like handle and take some action on?
That works so well for societal change as well, because oftentimes we have people describe preferred futures, the worlds we would like to wake up in, societies we'd like to live in, and then we have to essentially backcast, and you're calling so contrast. What would have to change? What problem would be solved? What movement would have to be formed? What breakthrough research finding would have to occur for us to be able to get from here to there? And that's where we find our opportunities for action, so that we're not just, as you say, living in some like utopian, well, I can imagine this amazing future, so, I've done my job now, but really not using the future as a escape from today, but using it as a way to find action.
Right.
Another question that I think many people will relate to and be interested in your answer to, is there a way to use, do you think, some of the techniques that you write about in your book to help with executives who are often under very short-term pressures, profits, the next quarter, the next business cycle, to have more foresight, think, fight short-termism, embrace long-termism, even if it's not 10 years from now, but just pushing against this quarterly short-termism?
Yeah, absolutely. Because that is exactly the space where everything contextually is oriented toward the short term. And of course, if we keep going that way, we miss sight of the long term. So some work has found that if you get executives to almost take the time travel trip and think ahead to the future, they end up writing more vivid and concrete mission statements. And those are the types of things that can really help employees, in other words, their employees, envision the future of the organization, right? So I can't say, stop short-termism, stop profit. This is baked into our society and organizations that are led, but exercises that get the executives and the leaders to think ahead can then sort of get baked into the way that they communicate, which can help other people think more vividly about where the organization is going.
And one of the things I like, I think we're talking about the same study, the instructions given to these CEOs and business leaders, it was so almost like science fiction mental time travel. Is imagine you have access to a time machine, you set the year for 10 years from now, and when you walk out of the machine, like something really positive has, happened, or your organization has contributed to some, positive change. Describe what you see, and that imaginative aspect of it, and really leaning into mental time travel, giving people permission to, play with this kind of ridiculous idea that you could have access to a time machine. It's so accessible, you don't have to be trained in some really amazing, systems and like processes. It's like literally just imagine you have a time machine and you went somewhere and things were better because of something you did or your organization did. Describe that.
Exactly.
So practical. I want to thank you, Hal, for joining us today and really helping us think through what is that connection between our future self and future society, and how we relate to our future selves and how we relate to the world we want to wake up in. I think there's so much room for rich intersections. And now that you've written this book, these ideas are out there. I think more foresight practitioners will be thinking about this. We don't ask people enough about their future selves in the context of these big issues we're trying to solve and address. So thank you for bringing that to our field and to the world. Aisha is going to drop the link to where folks can find this book. And before we go, I'll just remind people that we have lots of exciting things that you can join us for in the future. Give your future self something to look forward to. Upcoming, we have in just about a week, a signal swap where we'll be sharing some of those signals of change that can help you imagine the future in more specific detail. And this is really great. We just see what are our IFTF researchers excited about. They'll just share with you a signal they think is amazing and they'll riff about it, which is really nice to see. And our next Foresight talk, we'll be talking about strategic intelligence for aging populations with Jim Barnett, Director of Strategic Intelligence and Analysis for the AARP, which is amazing because in my research, we find that people often resist thinking about the future as they age, and how maybe you've seen this, because they think maybe they won't be there for the future, and it's painful, and there's an emotional resistance to it. So amazing that Jim is going to help us think about that. And I just want to thank everybody for joining us, and the recording will be online, and Hal's book is available today. And thank you all for making time for our future selves in this hour we had together today. Thank you, Hal. Thank you, everyone.